my earliest memories is going through a window with my mother. I was a child, and she had woken me up in the middle of the night and swearing me to complete silence. She took me into the bathroom and closed the door, opened the window, and took me out into the night. That changed my life. That was an escape from domestic violence, from abuse. She was fleeing it on her own, fleeing an abusive husband, and her act of love in taking me, her daughter, away from that abusive father changed me forever. But it wasn't just that single act of love. When we were crossing the grass and out into the street, a neighbor put us into their car and took us to a train station. Another neighbor bought us train tickets, and we crossed a couple of state lines, and we wound up in North Carolina at my grandparents' house. And for the first time in my young life, I was someplace safe and loved. The memory, not just of violence and abuse, but of escape from it, and what that meant to me has stayed with me my whole life. Because those collective acts of love, my mother being brave enough to really risk our lives, because if he had caught us, he'd have killed us. Brave enough to risk our lives to go out in the middle of the night, and then those neighbors to take us to a train station and to freedom and to safety. Those collective actions of love and kindness created justice in our lives. And as a child, as a teenager growing up, those were the stories then where I could find myself. And so I was born in the mid-'60s, growing up in the late 60s and 70s, and there were so many stories of the civil rights movement, and then Vietnam and Watergate, stories about us striving for justice, stories about finding and telling the truth. And so it's no surprise that faith leaders, the pastors of the civil rights movement, the journalists of that era, that pastors and journalists became my heroes. And when I grew up, I wanted to be one or both of those. And in the meantime, they're starting out in that home full of love in North Carolina. I was deeply embedded within church culture. And so I've spent most of my life, not all of it, in what people used to call the Bible Belt. They don't call it that much anymore, but it's this swath of Southern America. And we were a Christian family, we were a Southern Baptist family, and there was a lot of things that were meant about that. And a lot of that translated into gender identity and what women could do, what women couldn't do. And there was this collision between what drew me forward in life, these stories of justice and people taking actions of love for their neighbors, some of whom they didn't know, just to make sure they had justice. And then my encircling church culture, which talked about love, taught love, but always sort of brought it down. And so there's this set of verses in the New Testament called the Great Commandment, which is that you love the Lord with everything you have, your heart, your soul, your mind, your wisdom and understanding, and then you love your neighbor as yourself. And that kept getting narrowed down. And Jesus even warned about that. Told a parable that's in the Bible about the Good Samaritan, where somebody is beaten and left in trauma on the side of the road. And people pass this person who clearly needs help, who needs mercy and justice, because they decided that person wasn't their neighbor, and so they didn't help. And finally, somebody, a Samaritan in that culture, was considered less than, lower. That person stopped and helped. And for me, that story was all about why wasn't the injured man, why wasn't he our neighbor? Why didn't anyone help? But what happened in the church culture, the Southern culture that I was in, is that the idea of God, like it wasn't anymore that you could love God with everything you have, your understanding, your wisdom, your heart and soul. There was this very narrow view of who God is and how we approach God, him. And then for the rest of it, everything got narrowed. So it wasn't like everybody was our neighbor. It's like our neighbors came down to 3 or 4 people who were pretty much just like us. And then love, instead of love being out here, love kept getting narrower and narrower. Strict definitions around what love looked like and what actions of love looked like. And then me. So the great commandment again, love the Lord, however you want to describe that, your creator, the divine, whatever that connection is. And then your neighbor is yourself. And so if I'm diminished, if I'm a girl who can't grow up to be something, or a woman who's got a role that's this narrow, how do I get back out here? How do I get back out to where my heroes were with civil rights, or telling the truth, or trying to end war? And I had this dichotomy of wanting more than my culture would allow. And I kept trying to push against it and find ways. And I heard Juanita Rasmus talk about being a good girl. Well, there was that too. Like, what does a good girl do? Do you get rewarded for being what your culture wants you to be, or do you break out? And it's like my culture had all of these signposts that said, no, you can't be this, no, you can't do this. When inside me there was all of these other signposts that were like, but the truth will set me free, and I need to love my neighbor like myself, and that'll create justice and freedom. And so I'm going along, and the 2 things I wanted to be, a journalist and a pastor, actually happened. And I went to work for newspapers and magazines first, and sometimes even got paid to write. And but then in my church life, just in that particular kind of congregation, women aren't pastors. And when I was hitting my head against that ceiling and not sure what I could do, there was a male minister in the church that I was in who was also hitting his head against some ceilings. And he was really feeling a call to be out in the community, that the expression of love to our neighbors needed to be happening outside the church walls. And so he told me he was leaving. He asked me if I wanted to go with him, and he opened that window and he took me out with him. And a couple of years later, I'm an ordained minister. I'm the pastor of my own small congregation, very diverse, quite young. I was in my 30s, and I was often the oldest person in the room. So we were young, we were diverse, and we were really excited about this idea that we were figuring out ways to take collective actions of love that would bring justice to other people. So how are we going to love our neighbors ourselves, and how are we as a collective going to love our other neighbors as ourselves? And we identified homeless and runaway kids as a people group we wanted to work with. And there's a lot to tell there that I won't get into today, but I personally was excited about that because I found my story in some of their stories. Because while there are many reasons people run away and go on the streets, sometimes it's because they're fleeing domestic violence. And so it was very meaningful to me to be able to help them. And our church was finding ways to give them safety without imposing religion on them. It's their choice. We didn't want to do that. But to give them a new start in life, just as many of us felt like we'd been given a new start. And so we're going great guns, and I think that I'm finally free of a lot of the things that held me back. And then one day, it was a beautiful day like this, kind of cool, kind of sunny. A young man connected to my church came up to me and asked me if I would marry him. And I looked at him, and he said, well, what I mean is, will you perform my marriage? And he hadn't identified anybody yet. He wasn't ready to actually get married then. He just wanted to know if, when he found the right person, would I counsel with them and perform their marriage? I said no. And it's so painful to tell you this. And I have since had that's been redeemed in my life. And it was redeemed even sooner in his life. Can you imagine why I might have said no? He was gay. And for all that I was trying to create windows that we could take people through, open doors that we could take people through, I didn't understand how to create that action of love in his life that would bring that justice for him. And he forgave me almost immediately. It took me a long time to find the redemption and actually find a whole change of mind about it and heart about it. And as I reached out to say, you know, I would celebrate if you married, I just don't know how to do that for you. He smiled and he hugged me and he said, you know, I didn't think you could, but you seem different than the others, and I thought maybe you would. And he said, but you know, one day I'm going to find the right person and I'm going to marry him and there'll be somebody who'll marry me. And he was right. And he went on, and what happened in between those things is that then I got married. And standing here telling you this, imagine the guilt of saying, no, I won't marry you, but yes, I won't perform your marriage, but yes, I will make sure I myself get married. And my husband is here today. And he opened a door and took me through into a world that I didn't know what a healthy marriage looked like from the inside. I didn't know it could set you free. I didn't know it could open you up to become the best of yourself. I didn't know what a blessing it would be. And so on the other side of that door of being married, I began to work harder at the idea of how can this blessing be for everyone? And I began to work more and more about understanding how loving your neighbor leads you to commit actions in the name of that love that bring mercy and justice. And so if we really love our neighbors, then we want for them the rights and responsibilities, the privileges and the benefits that we have. So there I was, happily married, and realizing that that overcame the guideline or rule that a religious body would give. That those words of Jesus about love and about loving your neighbor was more important than somebody saying, our church doesn't do this. And I can't tell you how redemptive it was then when someone came to me and said, the Supreme Court has now legalized same-sex marriage, but judges all across Texas are refusing to marry us. Will you marry us? And to be able in that moment to say yes, and to deliver justice into their lives and redemption for myself by recognizing that what love looks like is that we don't just want for our neighbors the rights, responsibilities, privileges, benefits we have, but then we take actions to make sure that they have that. That theme of learning how to do that, of overcoming what I had been taught in the past and being set free to be able to love more and more and to see what those actions of love look like, have just motivated my whole life. And it led me up to that moment in January of 2017 when the women's marches were springing up all over the country, all over the world, and realizing there wasn't one for Houston. Well, there are a lot of folks in Houston who would like to stand up and say, we're not defined by hatred, we're not defined by racism, we're not defined by fear of the other. In fact, we love our neighbors, and we want to march for justice for our neighbors. And so I thought, this is who we are, and this is what we need. And so a group of other women, about 12 of us, we put together the very first Women's March in Houston. More than 25,000 people came and marched. And TV news crews were just stopping people and interviewing them. And they were saying things like, well, who are you marching against, or what are you marching against? And every one of them turned and smiled and said, we're not marching because we hate someone or are against something. We're marching because we love. We love our neighbors. We love immigrants. We love education. We love justice. One by one, the things they were naming. And so this movement started. So the march for us wasn't one day in January of 2017. It's been over 1,000 days since then. Of each day, month, year since then, collective actions. And so sometimes it's going into neighbors where there's low voter participation and registering voters. Sometimes it's bringing people together for trainings. Sometimes it's going down to the border and saying these people at our southern border are our neighbors. And we're going to take actions of love in their lives because we want to create justice. So let me tell you a couple of quick things. In the 2018 election, I got a phone call from a woman who was driving a van full of women to the Star of Hope, which is a woman's shelter here in town. They were, all of them, everyone in that van was fleeing domestic violence. And it was election day of 2018. And those women had nothing. I mean, a couple of them had little plastic grocery bags that had a couple of things in them. Some had nothing. They all wanted to vote. And so the driver of that van called me and said, I've got 6 women who say they're registered Harris County voters, but they don't have ID. I can't get them to their precinct. How are they going to vote? So we mobilized, and we started looking up their names and addresses to ensure that, yes, they were registered to vote in Harris County. And then a group of people went to a precinct and talked to the precinct judge and said, a van full of women fleeing domestic violence are going to come, and they need provisional ballots. They need justice. They need to be able to vote. And for that, several times this has come full circle in my life, that I've been able to do something, even something small, to help someone fleeing violence and abuse receive some sort of mercy and justice. And on that day, those women voted. And then, in that same election, we voted for people who would change how we vote in Harris County. So today is an election day. And if you haven't voted in the runoff, you can go to any voting location. You don't have to go to your precinct. They're completely set up no matter where you live in Harris County. If you're a registered voter, you can go vote. And so if that woman is driving a van full of women to safety today, she can stop anywhere. And that's what collective actions of taken in love look like. That it's not only justice for those 6 women, it's justice for everyone. Through our collective actions, we can continue to do this. We can identify people beyond just our circle and say, you're my neighbor, and I want to take a collective action of love for you, or maybe a personal action of love. Coming up in 2020, we are focused at Houston Women March On, which is the name of the nonprofit that started from that first Women's March in Houston. We are focusing on the census because everyone deserves to be counted. And you're our neighbor no matter when you crossed the border, no matter when you came to America, you're our neighbor, and we want to count you during the census. And then we want to register voters, and we want to do everything we can to get the vote out in 2020. These are only some of the ways, but these are our core focuses of how we can take collective actions of love. I don't know your story. I don't know if somebody at some point in your life opened a window and took you out of it, or if you in your life have done that yet for someone else. But that's part of our opportunity to say, I'm going to love my neighbor as myself. I'm going to make sure that I take the actions that give you whatever rights and responsibilities, whatever privileges and benefits I have, to try and make the world better so that you can have them too. If you would like to join us in collective actions of love, we've got a little button both on the Houston Women's March website and on my personal website. So if you go to Robin Paoli, ROBINPAOLI.com, or if you go to HoustonWomensMarch.org, you'll see a button that says Collective Actions of Love, and you can sign up to get invited to do things that say, I love my neighbor, and I'm going to take this action to bring more justice into their lives. I hope today that you receive mercy and justice from someone taking an action of love in your life. And then I hope you have or find or make the opportunity to take an action of love in someone else's life, even a stranger's life, and bring justice to them. Thank you so much.